High on a rain-soaked hill lived a man who had chosen silence over the world, a former rescue engineer who stopped believing he could save anyone after losing the one life that mattered most. On the road below, an elderly homeless woman and an aging German Shepherd K9 went door to door in the storm, asking only for a meal and one night of shelter. Every house was warm, every porch was lit, and every door stayed closed, until the old K9 stopped at a lonely cabin and refused to take another step. One knock that night would force a broken man to face a truth he'd been running from, a quiet injustice hidden in plain sight, and a final test of courage no one saw coming. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you believe kindness still matters, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of compassion, courage, and faith. Silver Pine, Oregon, was the kind of town that looked peaceful from a distance. A scattering of warm lights tucked between dark pine trees. A narrow main road that curved like it didn't want to be found. That night, the rain arrived sideways. Wind pushed it hard against rooftops, fences, and faces, turning the cold into something sharp and personal. It was the kind of weather that reminded people why they stayed inside, and why doors mattered. Margaret Maggie Lewis was 74 years old, though the rain made her look older. She was small, barely over 5 feet, with a narrow frame that had learned how to make itself invisible. Her gray hair was pulled into a loose knot at the base of her neck, strands escaping and clinging to her cheeks. Her coat, once brown, had faded into a tired color that suggested years of weather and apologies. The sleeves were too long, the buttons didn't all match. Her face carried lines that came not just from age but from restraint. Maggie was the kind of woman who smiled quickly and spoke softly, the kind who apologized before asking for anything. Years ago, she had been different, more certain, more anchored, but life had sanded her down into something careful. Losing her home hadn't broken her voice. It had thinned it. Beside her walked Bruno. Bruno was an aging German Shepherd K9, somewhere past 10, maybe closer to 12. His muzzle was silvered with gray, not just at the nose, but creeping up toward his eyes. His body was still large and broad, but the strength had shifted inward, less explosive, more enduring. One of his back legs dragged just slightly when the rain hit the joint wrong, a souvenir from an injury long ago that never quite healed. His ears still stood when they needed to. His eyes, deep amber, steady still, watched everything. A scorched fragment of old harness hung loosely around his neck. Not a leash, not a collar, just a remnant, edges blackened and stiff. Maggie had tried to take it off once. Bruno had refused, quietly, decisively, so she let it stay. They had been walking for hours. House after house passed them by, each one repeating the same quiet cruelty. Warm windows, curtains drawn, porch lights glowing like promises that didn't belong to them. Maggie stopped at the first door and adjusted her coat. She brushed water from her face, straightened her shoulders, and raised her hand. The knock was soft, almost polite. She waited. Inside, a television laughed. A shadow moved past the door. No footsteps came closer. Maggie nodded to herself, as if the house had answered her out loud. She turned away before rejection could harden into something heavier. Bruno stepped closer to her side as they walked on, angling his body so the wind hit him first. The second house was newer, bigger. The porch had a swing and a seasonal wreath that hadn't been taken down yet. Maggie knocked again, this time a little firmer. A man's voice murmured inside. A light flicked off. Nothing else happened. By the third house, Maggie stopped knocking. She stood under the awning, rain running off the edge in steady lines, and spoke quietly down to Bruno. "It's all right," she said, though it wasn't clear who she was convincing. "We'll try the next one." Bruno looked up at her, then back at the door, his ears tilted, listening. He waited a full 5 seconds before moving again. They walked. The rain soaked through Maggie's shoes, the cold creeping up her legs with each step. Her breath grew shallow, less from the walk than from the familiar weight settling in her chest, the knowledge that asking had once again changed nothing. At the fourth house, Maggie didn't even reach the porch. The owner saw them through the window and shook his head before she could knock. The fifth door opened an inch. A woman stood there, mid-40s, hair pulled back, warm light spilling around her ankles. She took one look at Maggie, then at Bruno, and her expression shifted, not fear, not anger, but calculation. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "We can't help." The door closed before Maggie could respond. Maggie stood there longer than she should have, rain soaking her shoulders, the echo of that sentence still hanging in the air. Bruno stepped forward and positioned himself directly in front of her, back to the house, chest toward the storm. He stood still, absorbing the rain, as if drawing a line between her and the night. Maggie reached out and rested her hand on his neck. "I know," she whispered. "I know, boy." As they walked away, Bruno's back leg faltered for half a step. He recovered immediately, but Maggie noticed. She always noticed. She slowed her pace. "I'm sorry," she murmured, as if the pain in his leg were somehow her fault. "Just a little further." Bruno did not protest. He never did. They reached the edge of town where the pavement gave way to gravel, then dirt. The streetlights thinned, replaced by darkness and the sound of wind moving through trees. Maggie's steps grew uneven. Her breath caught in her throat, each inhale burning colder than the last. She leaned forward slightly, trying to will her body to keep up. Her thoughts drifted, not forward, but backward. She remembered Bruno younger, stronger. The day a man in uniform had shaken her hand and thanked her for taking care of a hero. The plaque she never kept because it felt too big for her small life. The way Bruno had stood taller when people clapped, as if applause were just another sound to be alert for. That was before the fire, before the smoke, before everything burned down to choices and nights like this. A sudden gust of wind stole Maggie's breath. She stumbled, catching herself on Bruno's shoulder. For a moment, the world tilted. Bruno stopped immediately. He turned and pressed his side against her legs, steadying her. His head lifted, scanning the dark ahead. Something changed in him then. Not urgency, but decision. Bruno turned away from the road and tugged gently at Maggie's coat with his teeth. Not hard, just enough to ask. Maggie blinked, rain stinging her eyes. "Bruno," she said. He tugged again, then released her coat and started up a narrow dirt path branching off the road. He paused after a few steps and looked back at her, waiting. Maggie hesitated. The path was barely visible, swallowed by trees and rain. It didn't look like a place anyone went anymore. But Bruno was already facing forward again, ears lifted, body set. Maggie followed. The climb was slow. Mud clung to her shoes. Her legs shook, each step heavier than the last. Bruno stayed close, adjusting his pace to hers, stopping whenever she stopped. Halfway up the hill, Maggie bent forward, hands on her knees, breathing hard. The rain ran down her face, indistinguishable from tears she hadn't meant to shed. "I can't," she whispered. "Just a second." Bruno turned and pressed his forehead gently into her thigh. He stood there, solid and warm despite the cold, until her breathing steadied. Above them, through the trees, a faint glow appeared. One light, square, steady. Maggie lifted her head slowly. A cabin sat at the top of the hill, old but intact. Wood darkened by years of weather. A single window lit from within, glowing against the storm like a quiet refusal to go out. Maggie swallowed. "Someone lives there," she said, more to herself than to Bruno. Bruno's tail moved once. Not a wag, just acknowledgement. They reached the porch at last. Maggie stood under the overhang, rain dripping from her coat onto the worn wooden boards. Her hand trembled as she raised it. She hesitated. She had already heard enough no's for one night. Bruno stepped forward and sat beside her, facing the door. His posture was calm, deliberate, the way it had been when he waited for instructions long ago. Maggie took a breath and knocked. Thomas Reed had learned the sound of storms the way other men learned prayer. From inside the cabin, rain announced itself first on the roof, sharp, irregular taps that turned quickly into a steady, punishing drum. Wind followed, sliding along the walls, probing for gaps. Thomas sat at the small table near the window, his back straight without effort, shoulders broad beneath a faded flannel shirt. At 45, he was tall and solid, built not for display but for endurance. His hair, once dark, had begun to gray at the temples, cut short by habit rather than style. His face carried the quiet severity of a man who had stopped expecting surprises. Square jaw, deep-set eyes the color of steel, and a thin scar at the edge of his left eyebrow he never talked about. For 8 years he had lived alone on the hill above Silver Pine, far enough that town noises dissolved into wind and trees. He had chosen the cabin because it asked nothing of him, no neighbors close enough to knock. No reason to explain why he didn't come down anymore. He kept the place orderly, almost military in its simplicity. A wood stove near the wall, a single photograph face down on the mantel, tools hung where they belonged. Everything had a place, and none of those places required memory. When the knock came, it was so soft he thought at first it was just the rain finding a new angle. Thomas did not move. He kept his hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold, listening. The second knock was clearer, deliberate but restrained, the sound of someone unsure they had the right to ask. His jaw tightened. His first instinct rose fast and clean: do not open the door. Weather brought trouble. People brought questions. He had arranged his life to avoid both. The knock came again, followed by a sound lower, closer to the ground. Not a voice, a presence. Thomas pushed back from the table and stood. His movements were economical, as if his body still believed it was on call. He did not reach for a weapon. He hadn't kept one visible in years. Instead, he stepped to the side window and pulled the curtain back just enough to look. Rain smeared the glass, distorting the shapes on the porch. Then he saw the dog. The German shepherd sat facing the door, rain slicking his coat dark, ears lifted despite age, posture balanced and composed. His eyes, old eyes, Thomas noted, were fixed on the door, not pleading, not aggressive, waiting. Beside him stood a woman, small and hunched against the weather, her coat soaked through. She looked down at the dog as if drawing strength from him. Something in Thomas paused. The dog's stance was wrong for a stray, too deliberate. Weight centered, chest forward, body angled slightly outward as if shielding the woman behind him. Thomas had seen that posture before, years ago, in places that smelled like mud and metal and fear. It was the posture of work. He stepped back from the window and stood with his hand on the doorframe, listening to the rain, to his own breathing. The instinct to turn away was still there, sharp and practiced. But beneath it, quieter and more dangerous, was recognition. He opened the door. Cold rushed in immediately, clean and biting, carrying the smell of wet pine and earth. The woman flinched slightly, then lifted her head. Up close, she looked older than Thomas had guessed. Her face was narrow, lined deeply at the eyes and mouth, but there was a steadiness there, too. Pride, held carefully. She stood straight despite exhaustion, hands clasped in front of her as if to keep them from shaking. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said. Her voice was thin but controlled. "We were just hoping for one night out of the rain." The dog did not move. He watched Thomas with the same steady attention, head level, ears forward. Thomas's gaze dropped to the animal's neck, to the scorched fragment of old harness hanging there like a relic. He felt a small shift inside his chest, an old hinge creaking open. "Just for the night," Thomas said before he could reconsider. His voice sounded distant to his own ears. "That's all." Relief crossed the woman's face, quickly masked. "Thank you," she said. "I'm Margaret. Maggie." She gestured to the dog. "This is Bruno." Bruno stepped forward only after Thomas moved aside, crossing the threshold with care. He paused just inside the doorway and turned, scanning the porch and the dark beyond before settling near the door, body angled toward it. The behavior was automatic, ingrained. Thomas closed the door and slid the bolt into place, not making a show of it. He noticed, with a faint start, that he had done so without thinking. Maggie stood uncertainly, water pooling at her feet. Up close, Thomas saw how thin she was, how the years had taken more than time from her. Her gray hair was pulled back loosely, strands clinging to her cheeks. Her eyes were pale, observant, the eyes of someone used to watching rather than being seen. "You can sit," Thomas said, nodding toward a chair near the stove. "I'll get the fire going." As he worked, he felt Bruno's gaze track his movements. Not suspicion, assessment. The dog's back leg held a fraction off full weight, subtle but telling. Old injury. Cold made old wounds speak. Thomas knew that language well. When the fire caught, warmth began to creep back into the room. Maggie lowered herself into the chair with a soft exhale, shoulders sagging the moment she stopped holding herself upright. Thomas brought her a blanket and draped it over her shoulders without touching her, respecting a boundary he sensed rather than saw. He poured water into a kettle and set it on the stove. "Storm's bad tonight," he said, not looking at her. "You shouldn't be out in it." Maggie gave a small, humorless smile. "We didn't plan to be." Silence settled, not hostile but careful. The rain pressed against the cabin, insistent. Bruno remained near the door, ears still up, gaze sweeping the room and then returning to the entrance. Thomas watched him from the corner of his eye, the way he chose his position, the way his body aligned with exits. There was no mistaking it now. This dog had been trained. "What kind of work did he do?" Thomas asked finally. Maggie glanced at Bruno, affection and respect mingling in her expression. "Search and rescue," she said, "before the fire." Thomas's hands stilled. Fire. The word landed heavier than it should have. He nodded once and turned back to the kettle, busying himself with something he could control. As the water heated, his mind drifted backward, uninvited. 8 years ago, a different storm. Rain swollen into something violent, tearing through the valley below. He had been on site, coordinating evacuations, when the call came that his son's school bus had been caught on the wrong road. By the time they reached the ravine, there was nothing left to save. The flood had taken more than a life. It had taken Thomas's faith in preparation, in systems, in the idea that doing everything right guaranteed anything at all. He poured the hot water and brought Maggie a mug. She wrapped her hands around it, fingers trembling slightly before the heat steadied them. "Thank you," she said again, quieter this time. Thomas nodded, accepting gratitude the way he accepted weather without comment. He sat across from her, the table between them like a negotiated truce. The photograph on the mantel remained face down. He did not look at it. Bruno shifted once, then settled again, still facing the door. Thomas noticed how the dog's breathing changed with the room, how he never fully relaxed. The habit of vigilance did not fade easily. It lived on long after service ended. "You live up here alone?" Maggie asked, her tone observational rather than curious. "Yes," Thomas said. "It's easier." She considered that, eyes drifting to the walls, the sparse furnishings. "Easier isn't always lighter," she said gently. Thomas did not respond. He felt something stir, uncomfortable and familiar. He watched Bruno instead, the old K9 who had chosen this door, this hill, this night. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, a fragile pocket of warmth held. For one night. The cabin settled into a quieter rhythm as the storm continued outside, rain drumming against the roof with a persistence that no longer felt threatening, only present. The fire in the wood stove had grown steady now, flames licking the iron walls, radiating a warmth that crept slowly into bones and breath. Maggie sat closer to it, shoulders finally relaxed beneath the heavy wool blanket Thomas had given her. Color had begun to return to her cheeks, faint but visible, like a memory finding its way back. Thomas moved through the small kitchen area with deliberate efficiency. He didn't ask what Maggie liked. He opened a cabinet, took down a pot, poured in water, and added what he had: canned broth, dried vegetables, a small portion of rice meant for emergencies. His hands knew these motions. He cooked the way he did everything else, quietly, without ceremony, as if nourishment were a practical solution rather than an act of care. Bruno remained near the door. He lay down this time, heavy body lowering with a controlled exhale, but sleep did not come. His head stayed lifted, chin resting just above his paws, ears rising and falling with every change in sound. Even in rest, he guarded. The firelight caught the gray threading through his fur, highlighted the stiffness in the way he held his injured leg slightly angled. Fatigue sat deep in him, but duty sat deeper. Maggie noticed. "You don't have to watch anymore," she murmured softly, not expecting him to listen. "We're inside." Bruno's ears flicked once, then settled again. He did not move. Thomas watched this exchange from the corner of his eye as he stirred the pot. The dog's vigilance was not anxiety. It was discipline, long past needing instruction. He'd seen men like that, long after the uniform was gone, still standing their posts in quiet rooms. When the soup was ready, Thomas brought a bowl to Maggie and set it carefully in her hands. The steam rose between them, carrying a simple, grounding scent. Maggie stared at it for a moment longer than necessary, as if reminding herself it was real. Then she lifted the spoon. The first bite made her eyes close. She didn't cry, she didn't sigh, she just paused, spoon hovering, breath slowing as warmth reached places the cold had claimed too easily. When she opened her eyes again, they were brighter, though still tired. "Thank you," she said. This time, the words carried weight. Thomas nodded and returned to the stove, pouring himself a smaller portion he barely touched. He sat across from her, the fire between them like a shared boundary. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the hills. They ate in silence. Halfway through the bowl, Maggie shifted in her chair to adjust the blanket. The motion was small, careless. The strap of her worn canvas bag slid off her shoulder, and the bag tipped, spilling its contents onto the floor. A few personal items scattered, a folded scarf, a worn notebook, a pen with its clip broken. Then the papers fell. A thick bundle, bound loosely with twine, edges curled and water-stained. They landed near Thomas's boots with a soft, final sound, as if they had been waiting for gravity to choose the moment. Bruno reacted instantly. His head lifted, ears sharp, eyes locking not on Maggie, but on the papers. His body tensed, muscles coiling beneath thinning fur. A low sound vibrated in his chest. Not a growl, but a warning shaped by memory. Thomas froze. Dogs did not react to paper like that, not without reason. He leaned forward and picked up the bundle. The top page bore a printed logo, neat and official, letters too bold for something so cruel. A notice of foreclosure. Beneath it, loan statements, interest calculations, legal language dense enough to discourage questions. The dates told a quiet story. The numbers climbed fast. Too fast. Thomas looked up. Maggie had gone very still. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced tightly, knuckles pale. She did not reach for the papers. "It's not," she began, then stopped. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. "I didn't understand all of it," she said finally. "They explained it so nicely." Thomas said nothing. He laid the papers on the table, face up, not accusing, not gentle, just present. Maggie stared at them, then away. "I had a house," she said quietly. "Small, paid for. I lived there 30 years. Her voice wavered once, then steadied. "After the fire, I needed repairs, roof, wiring. They said they specialized in helping people like me. Fixed income, emergencies." She swallowed. "They said it would be temporary." Thomas listened. He did not interrupt. He had learned long ago that silence, used correctly, could be a form of respect. "The numbers changed," Maggie continued. "The letters came faster. Then men came, polite, smiling." She let out a short, humorless breath. "They told me I had a week, Bruno rose with effort and limped to her side, leaning his shoulder gently against her shin. Maggie's hand fell to his head, fingers sinking into his thick fur. The contact steadied them both. "He saved me once," she said, her hand still on Bruno. "Long before all this." Thomas's gaze sharpened slightly. "The fire," Maggie said. "Warehouse on the edge of town. I was cleaning offices there nights. Electrical fault, they said. Smoke everywhere." She looked down at Bruno, a faint smile touching her lips. "He ran in when no one else would. Dragged me out by my sleeve. Burned his harness. Hurt his leg." Her smile faded. "After that, he never liked closed spaces much. Neither did I." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a pressure he recognized but didn't welcome. He looked away toward the mantel where the photograph lay face down. He had not planned to think about it tonight. The soup grew cold. Later, when Maggie's breathing had evened out and fatigue finally pulled her eyelids low, Thomas moved quietly to Bruno. The dog watched him approach, eyes alert but calm. Thomas crouched slowly, keeping his movements visible, and reached for the injured leg. His touch was careful, practiced. He pressed gently around the joint, noting the stiffness, the flinch Bruno couldn't quite hide. "Old fracture," Thomas murmured, more to himself than to the dog. "Cold brings it back." He fetched a salve from a tin in the cabinet, warmed it between his hands, and worked it into the fur and skin with slow, steady pressure. Bruno did not pull away. He watched Thomas closely, then rested his chin on the floor, allowing the care. When Thomas finished, he sat back on his heels, breathing out. The fire crackled softly. Maggie slept in the chair, head tilted toward the warmth, face slack with exhaustion. That night, when Thomas finally lay down on the narrow bed in the back room, sleep came differently. He dreamed. Not of water or alarms or the sound of radios cutting out. He dreamed of his son standing at the edge of the creek behind their old house, boots muddy, laughing as he tried to balance on a fallen log. The boy turned and waved, unafraid, whole. Thomas woke with his heart pounding and his eyes wet, staring into the dark. It had been years since he'd seen that face in sleep. Outside, the storm began to ease, rain softening into something like mercy. Inside the cabin, Bruno resumed his watch by the door. Maggie slept wrapped in borrowed warmth, and Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling, understanding for the first time that some nights did more than pass. They cracked things open. The rain returned near midnight, softer than before but more deliberate, as if it had learned the shape of the land and chosen to stay. Water slid down the cabin's windows in narrow streams, catching the firelight in brief flashes before disappearing into the dark. Inside, the room held steady warmth. Outside, the hill listened. Bruno rose without sound. It wasn't sudden. No bark, no growl. Just the quiet certainty of a body that had decided something mattered. He stood near the door, head angled, ears lifting toward the back of the cabin where the trees pressed closer. His breathing slowed, measured. The old injury tugged at his leg as he shifted his weight, but he ignored it. Thomas felt it before he saw it. Years of habit sharpened his awareness, pulling him awake from the edge of sleep. He sat up on the narrow bed, listening. Rain, wind, and beneath it, something else. A disturbance too regular to belong to weather. He stepped into the main room, careful not to wake Maggie. She slept in the chair near the stove, blanket pulled tight, her face drawn but peaceful. Thomas paused long enough to make sure she was breathing evenly, then followed Bruno's gaze toward the back window. Nothing moved. Bruno's tail remained still. His eyes did not. Thomas crossed the room and crouched beside him. "What is it?" he whispered, not expecting an answer. Bruno took one slow step toward the back door, then stopped and looked back at Thomas. "Permission." Thomas nodded once. They moved together. Thomas eased the door open just enough to listen, cold air slipping inside like a blade. The rain muffled most sounds, but there, faint, deliberate footsteps where there shouldn't have been any. Not on the path, closer to the fence line. Thomas closed the door and slid the bolt into place. His jaw tightened. He'd lived here long enough to know the difference between animals and people, between wandering and waiting. He glanced at Maggie. She had stirred, eyes open now, watching him with quiet alertness. "Someone's out there," he said softly. Her face changed, color draining from her cheeks. She nodded once, as if confirming something she had already known. "They don't like it when you don't disappear," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled beneath the blanket. Thomas didn't ask who. He already understood. Bruno moved again, padding toward the far wall where the fence ran closest to the cabin. He paused, nose low, tracking something the rain had tried to erase. Thomas pulled on his boots and coat, moving with controlled speed. He grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, stepping into the rain with Bruno at his side. The night swallowed them quickly. The beam of the flashlight cut a narrow path through wet grass and mud. Bruno led without hesitation, stopping near a fence post where the ground looked wrong, too smooth, too recently disturbed. He sniffed once, then pawed gently at the earth. Thomas knelt and brushed away mud with his gloved hand. Metal glinted back at him. A small device, no larger than his palm, magnetized to the post. Wires sealed tight against moisture. Cheap, disposable, the kind of thing meant to be placed quickly and forgotten. Thomas exhaled slowly. "They're watching," he murmured. Bruno stepped back, eyes lifting toward the trees. The footsteps were gone now, swallowed by rain and distance. Whatever message had been delivered didn't need a witness. They returned inside, door sealed tight behind them. Maggie watched Thomas's face as he set the device on the table. She didn't ask what it was. She didn't need to. "I didn't sign it," she said suddenly. Her voice cut through the quiet, brittle but clear. "Not the way they said I did." Thomas looked at her, giving her his full attention. "They brought papers," Maggie continued. "Stacks of them. Told me where to initial, where to sign, said it was temporary, that it would help me keep the house." Her mouth tightened. "They didn't show me the part where I gave it away." Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Thomas nodded slowly. He had seen this pattern before, dressed in different uniforms, hidden behind different language. Pressure shaped to look like help. Fear turned into compliance. There's a woman in town, Maggie added after a moment. A reporter. She asked questions before all this happened. She hesitated. I didn't answer. I was afraid. What's her name? Thomas asked. Emily Carter. The name surfaced a memory. Thomas had seen her once, years ago, at a town meeting he hadn't stayed for. Emily Carter was in her mid-30s, tall and lean, with dark hair usually pulled back into a low ponytail that never quite stayed neat. She dressed simply, jeans, boots, weather-worn jackets, but carried herself with a directness that unsettled people who preferred silence. Her eyes were sharp, observant, the kind that noticed who spoke and who didn't. She had lost a brother to an eviction dispute that ended badly. Since then, she had learned to ask questions that made systems uncomfortable. She's been looking into it, Maggie said. Houses like mine. People like me. Thomas looked down at the device on the table, rainwater pooling beneath it. Something settled in his chest. Not anger, but alignment. A decision finding its place. Bruno lay back near the door, body angled outward, watch resumed. Maggie wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, eyes on the fire, as if anchoring herself to something solid. Thomas picked up the device and turned it over in his hands. I won't ignore this, he said quietly. The words surprised him with their steadiness. Not anymore. Maggie looked up at him, searching his face. You don't have to. I know, he said, gently interrupting. But I'm not standing aside. Outside, the rain began to thin, the storm easing its grip on the hill. Inside, the cabin felt smaller, fuller. Bruno shifted once, satisfied, and settled again. The line between shelter and action had been crossed. For the first time in years, Thomas Reed understood that opening a door sometimes meant opening a fight and choosing not to look away. Morning came gray and unsettled, the rain thinning into a mist that clung to the hills like unfinished business. The cabin felt smaller, with daylight pressing at the windows, revealing the scuffs on the floor, the worn grain of the table, the narrow paths people took when they lived alone too long. Thomas stood at the counter, phone in hand, listening to it ring. Bruno lay nearby, his chest rising slow and uneven, exhaustion finally claiming ground he'd refused to surrender during the night. Emily Carter answered on the third ring. Her voice was steady, alert, already awake in a way that suggested she slept lightly. When Thomas explained briefly, carefully, she didn't interrupt. Emily was tall and spare, with an athlete's posture earned not from sport, but from walking into rooms where she wasn't welcome. Years of reporting had given her a habit of leaning forward when she listened, as if the truth might slip past her if she relaxed. She had learned to keep her emotions contained since her brother's eviction ended in a spiral the town preferred to forget. I'll come up, she said when Thomas finished. Don't touch anything else. She arrived before noon, boots muddy, hair pulled back against the damp, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. Her eyes took in the cabin quickly, what was present, what was missing, what had been moved. She noticed Bruno first. Everyone did. That dog's seen things, she said softly, kneeling just enough to meet his gaze. Bruno lifted his head, eyes tired but assessing. He didn't flinch. He accepted her presence with the quiet dignity of someone who knew his role and intended to keep it. Emily examined the tracking device, photographed it from several angles, then wrapped it carefully. They don't usually get this sloppy unless they think no one's watching, she said, or unless they're in a hurry. Thomas nodded. He had the same red. There's more, he said, glancing at Maggie. Maggie stood by the window, coat on despite the warmth, as if ready to leave at any moment. Returning to town meant returning to faces that had looked away. It meant standing where she'd been told she didn't belong anymore. Her hands trembled slightly as she tightened the strap of her bag. I'll go, she said before anyone asked. Her voice was thin, but resolved. If we're doing this, we do it right. They drove down the hill together. Thomas took the wheel, Emily navigating, Maggie quiet in the back seat with Bruno. The town unfolded slowly, streets pale and wet, storefronts opening with cautious normalcy. Bruno's head rested against the door, eyes tracking movement, his breathing labored now. The cold had worked its way deep into him. Thomas felt a tightness at his throat and ignored it. Emily directed them to the edge of town where an old warehouse sat half-forgotten near the river, a place that had cycled through short-term leases and temporary fixes. Bruno stirred as they parked, lifting his head, nostrils flaring. He whined once, low, and pushed himself up despite the stiffness in his leg. "Easy," Maggie murmured, but Bruno was already moving, nose down, pulling them toward a side entrance choked with weeds. Inside, the air smelled wrong, chemical and damp. Bruno led them through narrow aisles to a false wall hastily installed. He stopped, planted himself, and looked back at Thomas. His message was unmistakable. Thomas pried the panel loose. Behind it, stacked boxes bore stamped logos and handwritten dates. Emily's breath caught as she opened the first one. Loan agreements, foreclosure notices, copies layered atop copies, signatures altered, initials added. A pattern emerged quickly, names circled in red, properties near roads and rivers, people with limited resources and limited recourse. "This isn't lending," Emily said quietly. "It's harvesting." Maggie sank onto a crate, her face pale. Seeing her name among so many others broke something open and stitched it back together at the same time. She wasn't alone. She never had been. Bruno wavered, then sat hard, strength finally ebbing. Thomas knelt beside him, hand steady at his shoulder. "You did good," he murmured, the words landing heavier than praise. They were a promise. Emily photographed everything she could, cataloged dates, matched names. Outside, word traveled faster than rain. A shop owner lingered near the open door, curiosity edging into concern. Then another. Murmurs turned into questions, questions into anger. By afternoon, people were talking. Not loudly, not yet, but the silence had cracked. They returned to town hall as daylight thinned. Emily carrying copies, Thomas carrying resolve. Maggie walked in beside them, chin lifted, fear present but contained. She recognized faces, some apologetic, some defensive, some relieved to finally have a direction for their unease. Emily spoke first, measured and precise. She laid out timelines, showed documents, named patterns without naming villains. When questions rose, Thomas answered where he could, his voice even, his posture unmistakably protective. He realized with a quiet shock that he was standing between harm and a person again, not coordinating from a distance, standing. A councilman shifted uncomfortably. A banker avoided eye contact. Someone at the back said, "My aunt lost her place last winter." Another voice followed, then another. The mask slipped. By the time they left, it was dark again, the rain returning as if on cue. Bruno had to be lifted into the truck, his body heavy and warm against Thomas's arms. Maggie touched Thomas's sleeve, gratitude in her eyes that didn't ask for more. At the cabin, Thomas set Bruno near the fire, wrapped him in blankets, checked his breathing until it steadied. Emily stood by the door, rain dripping from her jacket, resolve sharpening into something fierce. "This won't stop them," she said, "but it starts something." Thomas looked at Maggie, at Bruno, at the hearth glowing steady. "It's enough to stand on," he said. Outside, the hill listened. Inside, a line had been drawn. The morning arrived without ceremony, the way good things often did. Sunlight slipped through the pines and settled gently over Silver Pine, washing the hills clean of rain and rumor. The air held that crisp, honest chill that followed a long storm, and for the first time in days, the town breathed without flinching. Maggie stood on the porch of her house and watched the light move across the yard. It was the same house she had lost, small, cedar-sided, with a narrow porch and a railing that needed sanding, but it felt different now. Not because the paint was fresher or the roof newly repaired, but because the fear had lifted. Legal notices no longer waited in the mailbox like traps. The papers on the kitchen table bore stamps that mattered. Injunctions, protections, names of advocates assigned to her case. Federal investigators had arrived quietly the week before, suits plain, questions precise. The predatory web that had fed on silence was being pulled apart thread by thread. Maggie Margaret Lewis, 74, once careful to the point of vanishing, stood straighter these days. Her hair was still gray and unruly, her hands still thin, but her voice had found a steadier register. She had learned in a short and brutal season that dignity returned faster when it was shared. Behind her, Thomas Reed set a tray of coffee mugs on the porch table. He moved easily now, shoulders no longer locked against an imagined impact. At 45, he looked the same as before, tall, broad, hair graying at the temples, but something in him had loosened. He smiled more often, a small, quiet curve that didn't demand anything from anyone. He wore a jacket stitched with the simple logo of the place he'd reopened down by the creek. Reed Rescue and Recovery, a modest station with a single bay, radios tuned, lights checked. He had named it for his son, not as a monument, but as a promise kept in motion. Bruno lay at Thomas's feet, stretched out in a patch of sun, as if he had negotiated it personally. The old German shepherd's breathing was slow and even. His muzzle was almost entirely silver now, eyes softened by age but still bright with awareness. The bad leg troubled him less on warm days. He shifted carefully when he needed to, dignity intact. He wore a new collar plain, sturdy, and the scorched fragment of his old harness hung from it like a medal he'd chosen himself. A car pulled up the drive, gravel crunching. Emily Carter stepped out, camera bag slung low, hair pulled back against the breeze. She had slept little these past weeks, but the fatigue sat on her like earned weight. The investigation had moved quickly once the documents surfaced, and her reporting measured, relentless, had given the facts a spine. She nodded to Maggie, to Thomas, then crouched briefly to Bruno's level. "Morning, hero," she said. Bruno lifted his head, tail tapping the boards once. They drove into town together for the ceremony. It was held in the community hall, windows thrown open to let the light in. Folding chairs filled quickly neighbors who had found their voices, families who recognized their own narrow escapes in Maggie's story. A federal seal stood modestly near the podium, less spectacle than reassurance. When Maggie's name was called, she rose to a standing ovation she didn't try to deflect. She accepted the document, returning her home with both hands, then looked for Thomas. He nodded once, the way he did when a thing was done right. Then they called Bruno. The room quieted, surprised by the tenderness of it. A simple plaque, a few words read aloud: service, courage, rescue. Not everything he had done fit neatly into language, but enough did. Thomas guided Bruno forward. The old dog stood, posture still true, ears lifting at the sound of applause. Maggie knelt beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, and for a moment the years folded together. Firelight, rain, a door opening. After, the crowd lingered. People spoke in low, relieved voices. Apologies were offered without excuse. Help was promised and, this time, organized. Outside, the sun held steady. They returned to the hill by afternoon. Bruno claimed his place near the hearth and slept. Truly slept, the deep rest of a body that had been allowed to stand down. Thomas checked the radios at the station later, then closed early. He had learned the difference between readiness and presence. Maggie unpacked a small box of seeds on the porch: marigolds, rosemary, lavender gifts from neighbors who understood what it meant to plant again. She knelt in the soil, careful with her knees, and pressed seeds into the earth. "I forgot how this feels," she said, smiling to herself. "Having a front door that waits." Thomas watched from the steps, coffee cooling in his hands. "It's a good place," he said, "for roots." That evening, the house filled with ordinary sounds. Dishes clinking, a radio low with weather reports that no longer threatened. Thomas stayed. He had moved his things in gradually, not as a rescue, but as a choice. He slept in the small room at the back, door open, listening to the wind in the trees and finding it friendly. Days followed with a gentler rhythm. Bruno accompanied Thomas to the station sometimes, lying in the sun by the bay, eyes half-lidded but alert. Maggie walked to the mailbox without bracing herself. Emily's articles ran their course, replaced by the slower work of rebuilding trust. Federal inquiries continued, thorough and unhurried. Silver Pine learned how to speak without shouting. On a clear afternoon, Thomas stood at the creek with a group of volunteers, teaching them how to read water levels, how to move with patience rather than panic. He spoke of preparation as care, not control. When he paused, he thought of his son, not with the old ache, but with a steadier gratitude. Naming the station had not reopened the wound, it had given it air. At home, Maggie tended her flowers. Green pushed through soil. She laughed when the first shoots appeared, a sound that surprised her. Bruno lay nearby, head on his paws, tail moving in time with the breeze. He was content to watch, to be near, to let the days arrive. As the sun dipped behind the pines, the hill glowed. Light pooled on the porch where 3 chairs sat close together. Thomas poured tea. Maggie adjusted the blanket around Bruno's shoulders. Emily stopped by briefly, camera left in the car just to say hello. They sat without urgency. Silver Pine did not become perfect. Storms still came. But on that hill, a door stayed open. A dog rested. A man found his way back to standing. A woman planted flowers in front of a house that knew her name. And the light, when it came, stayed long enough to matter. Sometimes the greatest storms in life are not made of rain or wind. They are made of silence, of doors that stay closed, of people who feel invisible while standing right in front of us. This story reminds us that kindness does not always look heroic. Sometimes it looks like opening a door when it would be easier not to. Listening when the world tells you to look away. Standing beside someone when walking past would cost less. Most of us will never face a blizzard on a hill, but we all face ordinary storms every day. A neighbor who is struggling quietly, an elderly person who feels forgotten, a family weighed down by fear and bills, a heart carrying grief that no one else can see. God often works through simple choices: a warm meal, a safe place, a moment of courage. A decision to stay when leaving would be easier. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need hope today. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what this story made you reflect on. If you believe kindness still matters, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, so more stories of compassion, faith, and second chances can reach those who need them. And before you go, may God bless you and keep you. May He bring peace to your home, strength to your heart, and protection over everyone you love. If you agree with this message, please type Amen in the comments. Thank you for being here.